Hello, podcast, or Miss Felina, second hour when no one's going to be there. This is Lexi and my mother, Mendy.
Hello.
We did another podcast with my sister, Gabby, which whom you know, don't know English, and maybe I should, but she's working on her essay. So, today...
It's just the two of us now.
And it's just the two of us, no dog this time either. Today we're talking about romanticizing history, and specifically how it's shown in media, such as movies and movies.
Just mostly movies.
Yeah, that's what it really is. So the first question is, how do you see history? So what I mean by that is, when you look back into history, do you think of the reality of it, the brutality of it, or do you think of the fantasy that movies kind of portray it as?
Well, I mean, I think growing up, a lot of times you guys would see a movie and then you'd want to, you want to be a princess, or wouldn't it be great if we could live in a castle? And I would remind you that there's like a very small fraction of people that would actually get to live in the castle. Yeah. And even if you did, I always think of what things probably smelled like. I don't know if that's the scientist in me, but I think of the fact that they didn't have deodorant. They didn't take a bath, but maybe one time a year. And even when they did, I don't even know that they used soap. So things had to have smelled horrible in history. And I always think back to that. And for some reason, I guess I do realize that wars, especially with our Western civilization history, like kind of our heritage history where we come from, wars did play a huge part in just their everyday life. If you weren't a farmer, you probably were a soldier. And, I guess I tend to kind of glaze over that, and I more think of just like that everyday smelly life in the serfdom of the world.
Because even as an 18-year-old, I'm like, oh, it'd be so great to live in the 70s or the 60s or whatever. But then you just think of the skirts and the outfits and just the life, but you don't think of the Vietnam War happening and the Civil Rights Movement. I always look
or snail mail, or the telephone on the kitchen wall.
Yeah, you never really think of
about.
that,
right.
Because it plays the history, as we look back at it, it plays this fantasy. It's like, oh, that'd be so great to live in that time period. In reality, it was...
You forget you don't get to take the luxuries that you have with you to the outfits. And then
you even have to think back to that... Oh my gosh. Sorry. You kind of forget about the everyday life of someone.
Right.
Like, what time do they wake up? Blah, 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 blah.
And I think of that. I think of the sore muscles. Yeah. But maybe that's my age. Maybe that's the difference between being 30 years older than you are.
Yeah.
So.
And then I know our other podcast we talked about the books we read, An American Girl Doll and Dear America, because when I was younger, I read these Dear America books, and I feel like they did a really good job at talking about the brutality of everyday life. So I brought up, I want to say it was like blood in the snow, or bloody steps in the snow, or something crazy about that. It was about the Revolutionary War, and it was about how the soldiers had to walk weeks and weeks in snow and cold weather with no shoes on, and they contracted bunches of disease, and it was nasty. But they did a really good job at explaining that. But then also looking back, the girl met George Washington's wife. What was her name?
Martha, right?
Martha, yeah. She literally met Martha Washington.
in your book, you read?
Yeah,
awesome.
Yeah.
Well, I remember appreciating that you guys, even though it was fictionalized history, and I still enjoy fictionalized history. I mean, and there's been a lot of really successful book franchises for adults, like the Outlander series, and those that kind of like where they kind of take the skeleton of history and then kind of adapt and put either a romantic spin. There's definitely a romantic spin in that as well. But, or, like as a child, what would be a great thing for a child to do? Meet the president's wife. So they put that romantic story is woven into the gruesomeness of the everyday life of those characters.
But I don't think it really helped me growing up. I mean, it did help me because I was able to like whip out these historical facts out of my butt all the time. But like, think about that. But I kind of, yeah, because when you said that how, you know, it'd be so cool to meet the president's wife, blah, blah, blah. As in like a person growing up in that world, I was like, oh, that'd be so cool. Blah, blah, blah.
Right.
It really adapted how I saw history, because I'm like, that could have happened to me.
Right.
I think how cool it would be to live in that time period, blah, blah, blah. And wear those skirts and like cook over an open fire.
Because that's the hook that they use to, because hopefully no fourth graders like, oh, and then I met my husband on the Oregon Trail. You know, like that's not as appetizing to a fourth grader as doing something as important as meeting the president's wife.
Yeah.
So that they've woven that romance in that would be age appropriate for someone who's young.
Yeah, like, I also remember reading one of them. There's on the Oregon Trail, and I remember her describing how dry her lips were, and how they would put like grease on their lips. I remember thinking that was so gross. But so there's also like a romance in that.
But those books though at least had a hint of realism versus another set of books that are aimed at that same age group of girls, which is the American Girl historical books. Like those are so over the top romanticized and so fictionalized that I know that some parents really feel like those are a good choice for their daughters. I never really pushed them on you guys. I think we got a hand-me-down set from a work friend of mine, but I definitely saw them for what they were, and it was cotton candy. You know.
See, at that time I thought they were so cool because Samantha was my favorite, and she lived in 1904. But
I'm scared that you know that number off the top of your head.
But there was nothing. It was just like in 1904. Oh wait, the one thing that I think was romanticized in that book was that there was orphans that lived next door to her, and they were like little girls working in a little factory, and it wasn't romanticized, but it was romanticized enough for children.
Right.
Because I remember watching the movie, and a kid got his finger cut off, and everyone just like kept on looking.
Factory, right?
Yeah, everyone just kept on looking like they didn't pay any attention. Because if they did, they'd stop working, and then the foreman would kick them out and everything. So I think, yeah, there was definitely a lot of romanticization with like the Kirsten books and how she came over to America. And when she got off the boat, her whole, like the family friends were waiting for her and her family to take them back to Minnesota and stuff like that. That did not happen at all.
It did happen.
It could have happened, but the reality of it,
depending on who was traveling, sometimes if there was a single female.
It was a whole freaking family. It was like the mom, the dad, the three brothers, the sister.
It's very expensive. Well, anyhow, that we could go down and we could record that all day long. So, okay. What's our next question for today?
What is some of our favorite historical movies? We made a list.
We kind of looked through that, and there's some that I've seen, and again, age is to my advantage, but I tend to like movies that tell a story within the story. Like the example that I was giving Lexi earlier was about Schindler's List. We all know the horrors of the Holocaust, but it wasn't until the movie Schindler's List was made did I get exposed to that kind of story within the story about this man and his heroic act. And I kind of like historical movies that teach me something that I may not have ever uncovered before. So those are the ones that I'm kind of drawn to. And it probably does. Hollywood is always going to make things a little sexier than they should be. But that movie was brilliant. They filmed it in black and white to kind of show the grittiness of it, just of the era and stuff. You know, I mean, I think they tried, you know, it was Steven Spielberg, who is a Jewish Hollywood, star basically, and I think it was his homage to his heritage that he wanted to be as accurate as possible, and I do appreciate that when there's an effort made to really tell the story as true as they can.
Yeah.
So, but I know that that's not always the case a lot of times in Hollywood, and I tend to shy away from movies that like over glamorized, like, and kind of get called out for it. Like the movie Pearl Harbor is the one that got called out for. It's just blatant whitewashing of something so horrific.
Yeah. Because in my paper I talked about how the survivors, because it came out 50 years after 55 years after Pearl Harbor happened. And so there was still a bunch of survivors that were able to watch it and criticize it for how poorly represented their fellow soldiers were in that attack and stuff like that. And so, was there a romantic interest? There was a girl.
Yeah, there was.
There was a girl,
I think.
And then there was also Ben Affleck.
And there's Ben Affleck. I mean, really?
Oh my gosh.
If you're going to do something legit, are you going to cast Ben Affleck?
And then was Cuba.
He's turned his reputation around. But back in the day, he was not known for things like Gone Girl and stuff.
Yeah.
He was kind of a hot mess. And then he's in Pearl Harbor, and it didn't help. So,
no.
Next question?
Oh, well, the next question was like, how are they wrong and how are they accurate and stuff like that.
How are movies wrong and inaccurate?
Yeah, like the movies we talked about. I think we pretty much covered it.
You know, the one that we haven't really covered is Gone with the Wind, which I know that has become near and dear to your heart. Between reading the book and then sitting through a 4-hour movie with an intermission, which is kind of unique.
Yeah,
something we don't get to see very often. So, what did you take away from that whole experience? Your Gone with the Wind days.
I just remember sitting back and while just going through the whole experience and thinking, wow, this is just so weird to see. It's kind of hard to describe because it was during the Civil War. It was before the Civil War, and it was also during and after. And throughout, they barely even touched the topic of the Civil War. They just really focused on Scarlett O'Hara's life during it, but they didn't focus on the reality of it. Because when people think of the Civil War and Gone with the Wind, they think of like the barbecues and the dresses and stuff like that. But they don't think, because I remember that one scene when she's running and there's like the whole street of...
Oh yeah, Atlanta's on fire and she's running through the streets. See, and I always think of it, and maybe because afterward is one of those things that you read about that it was such a big deal. It was when she went to go find the doctor when Millie was having her baby, and you see all the soldiers laying out on the production lot. I mean, I think they tried to show the gravity in some places while covering the almost silliness or naivete of Scarlett O'Hara. So, I mean, I feel like even though you can focus on the idea that it was technically some kind of a love story and you can get wrapped up in that. But at the same time, I think that you can kind of see the blatant like disrespect for the slaves in their culture and how hard it was for people that, I mean, just think how earth-shattering it had to be to have that barbecue on the lawn and the hoop skirts and the slaves that tie you into your dress and have it all vanish within a several year period. It just completely gone.
They did touch on that.
So and then what would you do? And the fact that, and I still think it does kind of help highlight why I think the South is still kind of struggling. I mean, the North beat it to a pulp, burned it to the ground. And I still think as a culture, it still has a hard time surviving, you know? So that's what I think. But so I think just historically it tried. I mean, so what, do you remember when the movie was made? Do you remember
1936. No, 1936.
So, I mean, it's...
No, that's when the movie... 1939, because in 1936, that's when the book was published.
Okay. Yeah, so think of what... I mean, that was a hard time to be making something
First of all, that was like... In the Great Depression, the beginning of World War II, that was 4 hours. Think of all the extras, all that stuff.
And, and then movies had I mean, I guess they kind of have a similar purpose now, but it was a place to escape from a really horrible time in American history.
And I talked about that in my essay. You know, these Americans during that time just thrived to be anywhere but in their real world reality. You know, they would save up money just to like, be close to a movie theater and stuff like that. And so they would go back to the Civil War and go to that love story, just try to this horrible time, just try to get away from their real lives.
Well, and the book was very, very, very popular. Yeah, too. I mean, it was very much a instant bestseller, if I remember correctly. So, I think it's kind of like when people do that with authors today. There'll be a very popular book, and I can think of one off the top of my head, but I'm not going to mention it because this is a high school podcast. But
Shades of Grey.
And then, but you know, people demand they want to see a movie representation of something that was such a bestseller, and it's probably very much. Think how risque it probably was in the 30s.
Oh, yeah.
It probably had a little bit of
because there's a sex scene in that book,
right?
Yeah,
so, yeah. It was probably pretty crazy.
Yeah.
So,
and so how do you think how do they shape how you see history? Like looking back, because I know I talked about like when I was younger, I'd be like, oh, Civil War, I'd love to live in the Civil War. That's my favorite war. Remember when I'd have favorite wars. Oh my, I'm not a normal child.
You are not a normal child.
I still have a favorite war. I can't.
Right.
Yeah, it was a Civil War just because when I'd be like, oh, I love the Civil War, I would think back to the skirts and the lifestyle and not the reality of like waiting at home for my husband. Not the starvation that was occurring and not the poverty and stuff like that.
So they have because of the movies you've seen and the books you've read, it has shaped your perspective of history. Then you think?
Yeah, I think it definitely has
in a more romantic way, probably. Yeah. So
because the next question would be like, how do you think America thinks of history, like as a whole?
Sadly, I think America does a horrible job of thinking of remembering history, and that's why we teach it. Because we're failed to repeat it, and every day the ugliness that's going on in America right now is a repeat of ugliness we've had in our past, which is sad. And I feel like if people did a better job of studying history, I would hope that humanity wouldn't do what it's doing. But maybe not. Maybe we're just our humanness is uglier than we'd like to think.
One big cycle or pendulum.
Right. Yeah. It's not swinging in a good direction sometimes. Yeah. So hopefully your generation will clean up the mess that mine is making.
I think we should be fine. You know, after all of this, like, Stoneman Douglas things, I think we got a big voice.
I'm very proud of what the kids your age have been doing.
Well, at first I was like, oh my God, we're a mess. And then I was like, oh, actually, I think we're doing a lot.
I think you're doing a lot. You guys have a very optimistic viewpoint that I don't think my generation had. Yeah. So maybe we have taught you history a little bit better than we thought. So.
Thank you, Mr. Baker. Okay, I think we're going to end the I can't speak, podcast.
Podcast is over.
Okay. Bye, Miss Felina. How do I end this?